Welcome to Kiffin's Keep, an intellectual resource for the pillar and buttress of the truth, which is the church. This is a project of the London Lyceum, which is all about serious thinking for a serious church. I'm Jordan Stefaniak, host of Kiffin's Keep and president of the London Lyceum. And as always, I'm excited to be here today, where I'll be covering a couple of things, primarily a comprehensive, hopefully, articulation and defense of Credobaptism, along with some replies to some of the common objections that I've heard over the years. This won't be everything, but it will be hopefully a good amount of them. And finally, advice for those who are unsure of what to think about baptism in their own current context. Before we jump into the video, remember to like the video if you enjoy the content, or even if you just like the delivery, I'll take that. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. All the hot takes that coming through here. Hopefully we don't do a lot of hot takes, but maybe the content's hot. So subscribe and then comment with what you think, especially an episode like this. If you think I missed something, if you think I should have emphasized something else, if you think I'm totally wrong, which is totally possible, on a whole manner of issues, I'm sure you'll be happy to drop a comment. So go read those and see if you think I'm right or wrong. And finally, if you have questions, you can check me out at our website, thelondonlyceum.com/kiffins-keep. Now, typical preliminaries to a discussion like this. I am naturally an ecumenical sort of guy, and so in that sense, it's pretty clear that, while I take a strong position on baptism, and I'm a Credo Baptist, that doesn't mean that I can't work alongside and develop great friendships with those who are Paedobaptists. There's no reason not to. Baptism is not a first-tier issue, and if you think baptism in the sacrament of baptism, water baptism, is a first-tier issue, then that's a different discussion, I guess. But I think the mode, particularly in the timing of it, is a second-tier issue. And so we can do all sorts of manner of collaboration and work together. And I see no issues with that. I love my Paedobaptist friends, and a lot of them are a lot smarter than me and better Christians than me. And so, yeah, that's out of the way. Now, another comment is I have done other videos that are track on somewhat similar themes. So I'll drop them in the links in the description below. Some reasons, bad reasons to not be a Baptist, some good reasons to be a Baptist, and then I've done some stuff on open membership. So, for me, baptism, it's fundamentally a sign of the work of God. Now, if you talk to a lot of Baptists, you're going to get baptism as a pledge of allegiance or some silly thing like that. I think baptism is fundamentally, primarily, a sign of the work of God. It's His promise to us that we receive in baptism. It's a sign of both the Word and the Spirit. It's a sign of Christ's baptism that He underwent in His death and resurrection. It's a sign also of the baptism of the Spirit, which is regeneration. And I think you get those both in Scripture. And I think, so in simple terms, it's really just about our union with God, how God makes a promise and portrays it in baptism. And we believe it in baptism. So the faith of the believer, in that sense, is not the primary referent of baptism. And that might be a shock to you that a Baptist says that. I think that's absolutely right. There's a time where I almost stopped being a Baptist, and that was one of the most pressing needs for me, was to see that you could be a Baptist and say that baptism is not fundamentally about me. It's fundamentally about God and what He's done and His promise to me. But there is still a confession of faith that is a prerequisite for the proper subjects of baptism. And I don't think you can get around that. I think if you read the New Testament over and over, that is the pattern, that is the expectation, and that is the evidence that we have. And I think this sort of articulation, save the confession piece, is evidenced in the Reformed confessions by and large. Baptism is about engrafting into Christ. It's about remissions of sins. It's about newness of life. It's a sign of fellowship with Christ. That's very common. And I think it is given to those who confess the goodness of God. So I think the French Confession of 1559 gets this right in some respects, where it says that we are baptized, quote, so that we have a lasting testimony that Jesus Christ be our justification and sanctification forever. I think that is the primary point of baptism. And yet there is still the necessary condition of the confession piece. Now, some may say at this point that my view is not Reformed. Okay. That's a different argument, a different debate that we can have. Some might say it's crypto-reformed because I'm making the sign primarily referring to God. Okay, whatever. So let's be clear about a couple of things. We agree on a whole host of issues as Reformed Baptists. or covenantal Baptist, or whatever you want to call us. If you don't like the term Reformed, then I think you've got some other issues, but that's fine. So we have the same mode of salvation. We both agree that there are elect infants who are saved in infancy. We both think there's the same sort of the substance of the covenant of grace. For me, anyway, I think that there's one covenant of grace with two administrations, though I like the idea or terminology of a twofold economy better, which is actually the terminology that you find in this really nice looking book from Harrison Perkins, Reformed Covenant Theology. He mentions that terminology of the twofold economy. I think that better captures a lot of what's going on here than probably the administration, but the administration terminology still does some good work, so I use it. What's different for me is that there are different conditions for baptism. And it's only conditions for biological descendants, right? Because a Presbyterian or somebody else in a typical Reformed context is still going to require baptism upon a profession of faith for an adult. It's just when it comes to the infants and the children. And so in that sense, I will say the Old Testament is not wholly and exhaustively determinative for covenant membership. So I'm going to give three reasons here with a couple of other ones sprinkled in them. Three big, broad, I guess, categories for why Credobaptism is right. So the first one is covenant theology. Naturally, that is the locus of the discussion. And if you're a progressive covenantal sort of person or a 1689 Federalist sort of person, this to me is pretty open and shut. The Abrahamic covenant just is not the covenant of grace. Therefore, Abraham is not determinative of covenant membership. And so if Abraham and the promises in Genesis 17, for example, are not determinative for covenant membership, then there's not really much of a discussion to be had here. It's very obvious. If you take that route of covenant theology, then you get Credobaptism. But if you're like me and you say, I think the Westminster framework is basically right, where there's one covenant, two administrations, or twofold economy, then the Abrahamic covenant is the covenant of grace. And I think you find that in Galatians 3, 7, and 9. So if that's true, then why would you be a Credo Baptist? And I think there's two reasons for me. One is the nature of moral and positive law. And I think Sam Renihan is very, very helpful on this, outlining the categories here in his work. What is it? The Mystery of Christ, the book by Founders. I'll try to remember to drop a link to that in the show notes. And it's the reminder that covenants are not natural institutions. They are not moral laws. They are not natural laws. And in that sense, we can't always draw valid inferences from what is in a previous covenantal administration than what we can draw from each successive covenant. It has to be understood on its own terms. Now, there are connections, there are types, there are similarities and organic growth from one to the other, but we can't necessarily assume that just because this one has it this way, therefore this one has it that way. And so in that sense, I think that we have to come to baptism and the Lord's Supper on their own terms. Yes, the Old Testament and Abraham informs our decisions and discussions and theologizing on these things, but it doesn't necessarily mean they are in a one-to-one identical fashion. I think that's very, very obvious. Women are baptized in the New Covenant, whereas they are not circumcised in the Old. So there are discontinuities. Everyone must recognize discontinuities. They are absolutely there. The question, though, is what sort of discontinuities are there? And I think we need to push pause on whether we should give the sign to children or not, because I don't think that is given in the New Testament. And I think there's reasons to deny that. And here's one of those reasons. And it's the nature of federal headship and genealogy. So I think it's absolutely right to say that God deals with families in every single covenantal administration. This is one of the most profound things, at least for me, that helped me in thinking about covenant theology and Credobaptism and why you should be a Credo Baptist. And it's when I looked at the covenants and the structure of every single covenant. You have a covenantal federal head of sorts and the benefits and the curses flow through them to the children. And that's the case for Adam. That's the case for Abraham. That's the case for Moses. That's the case for David. That's the case for all of these different covenants. And that is also the case for Jesus Christ in the new covenant. Who are his children that receive the benefits or the curses based upon their federal head? Well, Jesus only has spiritual children, and that's exactly the sort of argument that you get in Galatians 3. Galatians 3:16. Now the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. It does not say and to offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ. And then it explains who are the children of Christ, those who believe in him, spiritual children. And so, yes, the genealogical principle is not annihilated. It is transformed in some respects. It is no longer purely biological. Now it is purely spiritual, in the sense of these are those who are the children in this covenantal administration. And if that's the case, those children are the ones who are supposed to receive the sign. So yes, the genealogical principle is not invalidated. It is just simply transformed in the new covenant. And it's following the same exact structure of federal head and children. And that federal head of Jesus Christ and his children are those who are spiritual children. To me, I think that's a very simple framework to understand why Credobaptism is right. If you follow the standard principles of covenants and federal heads, that is what you get. Now, here's the second reason beyond covenant theology, and that would be the regulative principle. The regulative principle, if you affirm it, so not everybody affirms it. If you're a Lutheran or something else, you're going to reject it. I get it, whatever. Or you're a Roman Catholic, you're definitely going to reject it because you're going to insert papist. I've been reserving Catholic for us Protestants because that's our word. It's not yours. Go ahead, do a video for me. The regular principle, if you accept it, is going to say that worship is limited by the revealed will of God, and that anything that isn't prescribed explicitly in Scripture should not be included in worship. And so the sort of principle here is that we have no prescription to baptize an infant in the New Testament. We have no example of it. There's no, hey, there's an infant here and they get wet, they get baptized. If there were, this would be an open and shut case. But if you affirm the regular principle, you can't draw inferences from other things in these ways, particularly when it comes to covenantal administrations, because these are not natural things. And so you can't draw a necessary inference based on it was done this way in the old, therefore it must be done this way in the new. That's just not how logic is supposed to work when it comes to covenants. And so if you affirm the regulative principle, you should affirm Credobaptism because you have no grounds on which to suggest or to argue that Paedobaptism is true. And finally, the third argument would just be some various scriptural texts, and these could be extrapolated into sort of like big, cool theological terms, but I just put them in here to list a couple of things. So one of those would be things like Acts 2:41 and sort of the pattern of they received the word, and this is what you get all through Acts. They received the word and then they were baptized. It's not they received the word and then they were baptized along with their unbelieving children, or just their families, whatever. It's just clearly that those who receive the word are baptized. That is the pattern. Receive the word, baptized out of the church. And you see things like John 4. John 4, 1-2 is talking about Jesus making and baptizing, what is it called? Disciples. It's not called disciples and their children. And disciples has a very specific referent in John. You look at John 8:31, you look at John 15:8, and other places where disciples are committed, devoted followers of Jesus. And that's who are being baptized. It's not being baptized their families and their unbelieving children, their unbelieving spouse. And I think even 1 Peter 3:21 corresponds to Credobaptism because it's supposed to say that baptism corresponds to a type of confession, an appeal for a good conscience. And so for me, when I think of baptism in that context, that seems to suggest Credobaptism is true and not infant baptism. Other texts, interesting texts, Acts 21:17-25. Here we have Paul being sort of pushed against, saying like, hey, we know that you teach that you don't have to circumcise your children anymore, all these different things. We know that you do follow the law, so like prove that you follow the law, etc. The point here is that the Jewish church thinks that circumcision is continuing alongside baptism. And Paul doesn't correct them and say, wait a second, baptism replaces circumcision. So stop making that argument. If it were the case that there was a pure one-to-one correlation between these two practices, between these two rites, there would be a clear and easy theological resolution in Acts 21. But there isn't. And that's because baptism is a greater and fuller and bigger sign than is circumcision. There's other texts that sort of cast this sort of idea where baptism isn't completely a one-to-one correlation with something like circumcision. So you go to something like 1 Corinthians 10, where baptism is linked to the Exodus, to the baptism into Moses, and not just circumcision. But you also have, I mean, you're replete in the New Testament all over the place where covenant members are supposed to be those who are spiritual and not physical. There's constant push to say, not of blood, not of flesh. Those who are children of God are those who are the children of the Spirit. And so there's this constant push to say that the covenant community is supposed to be made up of those who profess faith in Christ. Now, there are numerous objections to Credobaptism. A lot of them are bad. And go to my video on the bad reasons to not be a Baptist, and you'll see some of them, because I think I hear some of the similar ones over and over and over again. A lot of people who reject Credobaptism or the Baptist, faith and practice do it for reasons that are more psychological, sociological, political, and not necessarily theologically justified. They turn to Paedobaptism in search of a sort of like theological justification to justify why they want to leave this Baptist church or to join this other church. And so they're not really doing it because they're truly convinced of something. And so this would be, something along the lines of, man, this Baptist church, they're congregationally run. They've got all these problems, blah, blah, blah. Look over here across the fence at this green, luscious grass, at this Paedobaptist church that's well organized and a well-oiled machine. Well, what you find out is you go over there and they have the same sort of problems that you had at your other church, and that the theological position doesn't actually solve a whole lot for you. But here, let's go through some objections. So one of them would be that if you change the conditions for baptism, meaning that only confessing believers are allowed to have the sign, then you're altering the structure of the covenant community. And I don't think that's true. Why would that be the case? I mean, is the structure of the covenant community altered because women now receive the sign in the new and not the old? Certainly not. The covenant community remains internally believers alone, and externally, I think it does remain believers and their families. Presbyterians recognize this. Lutherans recognize this with this like communicant status, where a child, even if they're baptized, they're not really part of that covenant community until they reach this status of taking it for themselves. We're just saying that is like that, wherever that is, where they become a member of the church, that's where baptism is supposed to go. And so fundamentally, the structure of the covenant community is the same. And that might upset some Baptists. I don't know. That's fine. Drop a comment and tell me why you think I'm wrong. But I think fundamentally, I mean, my children are still going to experience the same things that any other child is going to experience. They experience the word preached. They get to observe the sacraments. They ask me, my oldest 5-year-old son tells me all the time that, oh, you drink God's blood. He's seeing it, witnessing it, observing it. All these things are still happening, not partaking. I guess that they're continually happening. So I think it's fundamentally the same sort of structure. Another objection would be, well, you don't agree with infant regeneration. That's possible. Well, of course, if you're a confessional Baptist of the Second London variety, it's in your confession, and so you do agree with infant regeneration. And so that's just a moot point. Of course, I've covered this a little bit, but the common refrain is, well, circumcision and baptism are so linked that baptism just replaces circumcision. Therefore, anything true of circumcision is true of baptism. And I think that's a foolish argument. Now, there are a lot of Baptists who are dumb here and will say, well, circumcision didn't relate to the circumcision of the heart. That's what baptism does. And so it's a completely different sign. And I think that's foolish. Circumcision does refer to the circumcision of the heart. I think you find that in places like Deuteronomy 36. But you also have interesting Old Testament texts here. Jonah 3 tells us that Nineveh repented, but they are not circumcised. Melchizedek is not circumcised. And that's because circumcision is a national sign. It's a seal of the land of Canaan. It's a physical promise of the physical covenant with Hagar. Therefore, we can't base our argument for baptism upon the Hagar covenant. We have to base it upon Sarah's covenant. And so I think that's important. Another common objection is that 1 Corinthians 7, right, where there's this category of being holy but not regenerate. But where if you're a believer, then your spouse is clean and your children are clean, they're both holy or whatever. This is not about baptism, because if it were about baptism, then my unbelieving spouse, who's the same age as me and cognitively able as me and is holy, should receive the sacrament of baptism, but no one wants to do that. And I don't think you should, because these are categories. Holiness is categories about being clean or unclean. It's not fundamentally about being baptized. He could have said baptized, be baptized if he wanted to. And this is quite simple. You have all sorts of arguments for this. You have the grandparent principle, where if this were true, then you should be able to baptize children based upon the professing faith of grandparents or great-grandparents. Now, other traditions will do this, but if you're in the Reformed tradition, you will not do this. And that's a really strong inconsistency. I think it's important to note texts like Joshua 5, where all have the right of circumcision, not just those who have believing parents. It's all physical descendants. And so if you want to be consistent with the old and allow those principles to carry over, then you have to do that. But most in the Reformed communities are not going to be willing to do that. Other objections would be things like Acts 2:39, where Peter is preaching and he's promising, this promise is for you and all your children. And it's supposed to be a reference to Genesis 17 and saying this is substantially the same, and therefore your children are members of the covenant and should receive baptism. What if the referent there is Matthew 27:25 and the claim of the Jews that the Lord's blood would be on them and their children? And so Peter is saying this promise is for you and your children to absolve you of that guilt and to save you and forgive you. But there's other reasons that is not necessarily the case. There's other objections like Matthew 19, Luke 18, infants, children brought to Jesus, the kingdom belongs to them. That is not about baptism. I love it. I think it justifies infant dedications. I think we should do child dedications as Baptists. I think it's a wonderful thing. I think the Lord would be pleased. Go ahead, drop a comment why you think that's crazy. I think it's right on. There's other stuff, other texts, like the church is supposed to remain a mixed community, Matthew 13, the wheat and the tares. The Baptist ecclesiology is somehow having an over-realized eschatology, is trying to sort the thing. You got regeneration goggles, whatever. No, that's not the case. The community remains mixed into the new covenant. Then that's a fact that everybody has to deal with. The reality, though, is we're not intentionally engrafting into unbelieving people to enhance the mixed nature of the community, because we're looking at children and saying, we will wait to baptize you until you have a profession of faith. Now, are you actually regenerate? I don't know. We're basing it upon a profession. Of course, there's all, the objections of church history. Well, what happens for all the church history? You have infant baptism right here in the 200s. Well, I think the first couple hundred years of the church are a lot murkier than you think and have a lot more credence for Credobaptism than you think. Go do your homework. So there's a lot of papist propaganda out there that makes you think that it's all infant baptism right there. That's not true. And then, yes, there is a strong, infant baptism for 1,000+ years, whatever. But the reality is that most of us today are discontinuous with the reasons that they would be baptizing infants then. So there is discontinuity for me and for you. If you're a Presbyterian or somebody like that, there's strong discontinuities. The federal headship arguments for Paedobaptism just don't exist. That's a novel thing. So I'm novel, you're novel, we're both novel, we're on the same team, novel. We're original creators of our own tradition, right? And so I think that argument ends up cutting both ways against everybody for different reasons. Now, there's also the aspect that, the argument that the Baptist version makes the covenant of grace less gracious in the new than it was in the old, because you're excluding people that were previously included. Now, my argument here is twofold. Number one, if that's the case, then we, in the new covenant, quite clearly have a less gracious covenant meal, if we want to use that sort of principle. Why? Because if you look at Exodus 12, infants were admitted to the Passover meal, and that's the Lord's Supper. That's continuous with that. And so if you don't practice Paedo communion, you have a less gracious meal. And so in that sense, we're both less gracious. So I just don't think that argument is very good. I'm showing you sort of parallels of if you do this, then you have this, and that's why it's wrong. I could develop that further, but I'm not going to. Of course, there's always the pushback on household baptisms, and I want to say, well, look, if you want to do household baptisms, then you have to be willing to do all physical descendants and servants and everything. Are you willing to do that? No? Okay, then that's a moot point. If you are, then that's a further discussion to show that, well, there's still no infants present there. You don't have any proof of that in any sense. Okay. That's a pretty quick rundown and overview in my take of why Credo Baptism is right and some of the objections against it that I think are faulty and don't sufficiently hold weight. Maybe you think I cursorily dismissed a reason or a view and that it should have been given more weight. Drop a comment, let me know. Maybe I'll do a future video on something along these lines and to elaborate and to explain further. Trying to give a quick crash course on this in a sort of semi-comprehensive way, but also in a way that I do this quickly enough that I don't have to pause it and go take care of my infant son who's been waking up like every 30 minutes because he's teething and he's having a sleep regression and all that stuff. So I'm trying to mash this into a proper time size because I just put him to sleep and now I'm here doing this. It's 12:41 a.m. But I love this because it's fun and hopefully it's useful because I keep getting a lot of people asking like, hey, can you do a video on Credobaptism, why you think it's right, or some of the reasons you think it's right, some of the reasons that are against it that you would say these are the reasons, though you shouldn't take them seriously. But here's my advice. I mentioned I was going to give some advice. If you are debating whether Credobaptism is right, or let's just put it this way. If you're a Credo Baptist and you're unsure and you've thought about converting and becoming a Paedobaptist, converting, it's a strong word. I don't mean in that sense. If you're thinking about becoming a Presbyterian or becoming an Anglican or becoming a Lutheran or whatever, but you're unsure and you're doing it for reasons, various reasons, here's my advice. Don't change. And here's why. You should stay. Because I think God's providence teaches us to stay. Unless you have great, deep theological conviction where you cannot shake it from the text of Holy Scripture itself, I think you should stay and say, you know what? There's ambiguity here, there's unclarity here, and I have to be content with that. Because no matter what you do, you're going to never be totally content. You're going to hit a place where you're still unsure, and you're still going to wonder, did I make the right decision? And so if you are in a church context currently, you know people, you've worshiped here, you know your pastors, you have relationships and friendships, you should not break those bonds. Absolutely not. The Lord providentially put you there for a reason. He made you a Baptist or not a Baptist for a reason. I would suggest and highly encourage you to not change. I think that is unwise. And here, listen to Benjamin Keach. I think he has great advice here. He's got a sermon on acknowledging God and seeking Him and joining to a church. And he says this, if thou art tempted to leave a true church because of some offense taken, and we could insert here some doctrinal position shaken, acknowledge God, seek to Him, consult with the word of God, lest it be from Satan a temptation and rises from thine own evil heart. Say, shall I not be a covenant breaker, a disorderly person, and an evil example to others? Will it not offend God or stumble my weak brother? Thus reason with thyself, say, shall I consult with flesh and blood? And I can old English stuff, I can't even see what they're saying. My corrupt heart part. This may deter thee from it. Basically, his idea here is to say, don't leave a true church unless you are totally, completely convinced from Scripture itself. You could be a covenant breaker. You made a covenant with this church. You could be a disorderly person causing all sorts of confusion and discord because there are weaker brothers that might not understand what you're doing or why you're doing it. And so I would commend to you, if you're unsure, to stay. There are problems at your church, yes. There are confusions that maybe they don't properly prioritize some of the things that you think matter. Maybe they don't prioritize the fact that baptism is a sign and seal of the promise of God, of the covenant of grace, and they don't emphasize it. It's a pledge of allegiance for you. It's a sign of your testimony, and that's it. Yeah, that's frustrating. Don't leave your church, okay? Bear with them, labor with them in love, stick it out. The Lord will bless you for that. Now, and that's true for, I guess that's true for any denominationally or changing sort of move. I think you should stay and trust the Lord's providence that He put you and formed you in those traditions, because the reality is each Protestant and Christian tradition has something beautiful in it that teaches us, that grows us, that nurtures us, and we need them all. We need strong, healthy people in all of those traditions to be growing and strengthening those traditions. and the Lord uses them all. And so you stay in the one you're in unless you're absolutely positively convinced otherwise. That's my advice. Maybe you disagree, and you could drop a comment why you think otherwise. Now, some resources, a couple of them, two of them, books. I would still say Brandon Jones, Waters of Promise. We've done a podcast episode with him in the past. I think his book is excellent. The reason it's so excellent in my mind is because he argues that baptism is a promise of God. That's the primary referent, right? He's got some stuff I disagree with. It's weird, but that's cool. We like disagreeing. That helps us to open up ideas and understand things better. Another book is Paul Jewett, Infant Baptism in the Covenant of Grace. It's a classic. It should be more read. I'd love to reprint it in a new typesetting and a new cover and everything. Maybe we'll do that one day. But I think that's another valuable resource. There are others. I know I've written an essay that's gotten all manner of disagreements from the 1689 Federalists because they think I'm writing primarily about 1689 Federalists, which I'm not. There really hadn't been a lot of literature on that when I was writing that essay, so people read into that a lot of more than they need to. And yeah, I wrote that when I was young and fiery and feisty and had some fun stuff in there, so that's fun. So go read that if you want. Reforming Credobaptism. It's like a Westminster alternative or something. The fundamental idea there is some of the stuff I've shared here, where like covenant membership and federal headship, how that functions and how that works, and how you can still affirm one covenant, two administrations, and yet be a Credo Baptist. How I think it's more consistent with theology and the scriptures. Okay, that's it for now. I'd love to hear your feedback. Do you think this was helpful? Do you think it wasn't helpful? I'm sure I probably upset everybody along the way. So hopefully we can still be friends. That's part of what I do this for, is because it's fun to talk with friends and to put your ideas out there and to get feedback and to realize, hey, I'm totally wrong on this, or I can understand something in a new way. So hopefully I've helped you or encouraged you or caused you to think in some way, because that is what I'm trying to do here. So thanks to everybody for tuning in to Kiffin's Keep, and I look forward to thinking with you all soon.